Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, and with me is Sam. Today, we're getting into wedding plus ones, and why a simple guest list decision can turn into a whole status test about who counts, who doesn't, and who gets to bring a person.
Yeah, because this is never just about a chair. One extra guest can change catering, venue size, rentals, even the seating chart. So the who can come question is also a money and logistics question people keep pretending is purely personal.
Right, and that's why it gets weird fast. Let's start with the blunt version. Plus one rules are basically where wedding planning meets social ranking. Sam, start us off.
Okay, here's the ugly little truth. A wedding plus one is never just a plus one. It feels like a ranking decision dressed up as planning.
That's the part people pretend isn't happening. They call it seating or budget, but everybody reads it as a verdict on how serious your relationship is, or whether you count at all.
Right, and once you hear it that way, the whole thing stops looking like simple logistics. It becomes, okay, who gets treated like a real unit and who gets asked to show up solo and smile about it?
And that is exactly where people get touchy. Nobody wants to say, we were counting chairs, because the other person hears, we were counting your importance.
Which is why one little invite can blow up into a whole emotional court case. Somebody sees their partner left off the list and immediately thinks, oh, so we're not real enough for a second seat?
Sometimes, yes. And sometimes the host is doing something much less dramatic, like trying to stay inside a budget or keep the guest count from turning into a disaster. That doesn't erase the sting, but it matters whether the decision was meant as a signal or just landed like one.
Sure, but the impact is still real. If you're the person who got invited without your partner, it doesn't feel like an abstract planning constraint. It feels like we liked your company, but not enough to acknowledge the relationship attached to it.
That's the social read, yes. The cleaner version is that weddings compress money, etiquette, family politics, and ego into one tiny decision. So every choice gets overinterpreted because there's no neutral way to read it.
That's what makes it such a good little drama machine. You're not just deciding who gets a meal. You're deciding whether somebody's partner is treated like part of the social fabric or like an optional accessory.
Okay, but let me narrow that. The problem isn't always that the couple is ranking people on purpose. A lot of the time, the problem is that they never say the rule in a way that sounds consistent or fair. So everyone fills in the blank with their own grievance.
So am I overstating it if I say plus one policy is where everybody discovers they have a secret theory of legitimacy? Like, who counts as a serious partner? Who counts as a phase? Who counts as just a date, even when nobody says that out loud?
No, that's the useful suspicion. People absolutely do read it that way. The overclaim would be saying every host is making a deliberate judgment about a couple's worth, when sometimes they're just making a clumsy decision and hoping the hurt feeling stays private.
Which is a very optimistic hope, because wedding guests are basically unpaid analysts. They see one missing plus one and immediately start reverse engineering the whole social hierarchy.
That's true. And honestly, it's not insane. A wedding is one of the few places where the host is openly arranging status, proximity, and attention all at once. So people are going to notice who got invited, who didn't, and who got treated like a unit versus an individual.
And then everybody acts surprised that the guest list turned into a referendum. No, of course it did. You handed people a formal excuse to compare themselves to everyone else.
So the starting position is simple enough. A plus one decision is practical on paper, but socially it lands like a judgment unless it's handled with a lot of care. The question is, how much of that judgment is inevitable And how much is people making it worse by being vague about what they're actually doing?
Okay, but before we get righteous about guest lists, we should name why this feels loaded in the first place. Nobody hears no plus one and thinks, sensible logistics. They hear a little social ranking system humming underneath it. And that is exactly why people get twitchy so fast.
That's the suspicious version, and it isn't crazy. A +1 decision can feel like a verdict on how serious your relationship is, how close you are to the couple, and whether you belong in the inner circle or the outer ring. That's a lot of meaning to hang on one envelope.
And once that idea gets in there, the explanation doesn't land as neutral anymore. Budget sounds like code. Venue capacity sounds like cover. And we're keeping it intimate starts to feel like a polite way of saying somebody's not important enough to make the cut.
They hear, you don't count.
Yeah, that's the bruise. It's not confusion about arithmetic. It's the message underneath it. People start reading the invite like a verdict on legitimacy. Am I your real partner, your real friend, or just somebody the couple will accommodate if the spreadsheet behaves?
Right, because weddings are weirdly good at turning categories into feelings. Couple, friend, sibling, cousin, coworker. Everyone is trying to figure out where they sit. And one missing name can feel like a tiny demotion with nicer paper. That's why the reaction is so fast. The symbol is doing more work than the logistics.
So what part of that is actually fair to feel offended by? And what part is us turning a hard planning limit into a personal attack? Because those are not the same thing, even if they show up in the same fight. One is hurt feelings. The other is a conclusion about motive.
The fair part is the impact. People do not invent the feeling out of nowhere. If the couple has already been sloppy about inclusion, or different people are getting different rules without explanation, suspicion is going to show up fast. The overreach is jumping straight to malice from one invite list, like the whole wedding is a coded message about your worth.
And family politics makes that suspicion 1,000 times louder. If one cousin gets a +1 and another doesn't, nobody thinks, neutral policy. They start doing emotional bookkeeping. Friend groups do it too, honestly. The whole thing turns into a hierarchy audit, and suddenly everybody's got memory going back 3 summers and a bridal shower.
Or at least an invoice. And the RSVP card is somehow supposed to stay emotionally blank, which is adorable. It becomes a proxy fight over who's favored, who's tolerated, and who's being asked to swallow the polite version of the truth. That's why people don't just shrug and move on. They start wondering what else the couple means without saying it out loud.
That's why people don't just ask, can my partner come? They ask it like they're asking whether the couple sees them as a unit or as a single person with a negotiation attached. And if the answer feels flaky, the hurt shows up immediately. Because now it's not about one date, it's about whether the relationship is being treated as real.
Exactly. The suspicion is really about legitimacy, not seats. That doesn't mean every refusal is shady, but it does mean the feeling is understandable. If we don't define the terms, everybody just argues from vibes and then acts surprised when the room gets weird. So the next step is drawing the boring line between hurt, hierarchy, and actual unfairness.
And there's a reason the bad version lands so hard. If the couple says no +1 to somebody who's been bringing the same partner to everything else, that doesn't feel like logistics. It feels like a sudden downgrade with nicer stationery.
Yeah, because the wound isn't just, I have to come alone. It's, You were willing to recognize this relationship until the guest list got tight. That doesn't prove bad intent, but it explains why people hear disrespect before they hear arithmetic.
And to be fair, sometimes it really is just capacity. Small room, expensive head count, awkward family math. But the emotional read still happens because the couple is asking people to separate the policy from the meaning. And that's a pretty big ask when the wording is vague.
That's the key distinction. Intent can be clean, and impact can still be rough. A couple can be trying to keep things fair and still communicate badly enough that it looks personal. The question is whether the discomfort comes from a one-off exception or from a pattern that keeps telling the same story.
So the line isn't if somebody feels hurt, the couple is guilty. It's more like if the explanation changes depending on who is asking, people are going to assume status math is in play.
That's fair. Consistency matters a lot. If your best friend gets a partner, your cousin gets a partner, but one person gets told to be understanding with no real explanation, the problem isn't just the head count. It starts to look like rank, even if nobody sat down and drafted a villain speech.
And once it looks like rank, every refusal feels personal. You don't hear, sorry, there's no room. You hear, you are not one of the people we were excited enough to make space for. That may not be what they mean, but that's the social translation people do instantly.
Which is why the polite answer and the real answer are often talking past each other already. The polite answer is about limits. The real answer is about whether the limit is being applied evenly, or whether the couple is quietly sorting people into categories and hoping nobody notices.
And people always notice. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not fairly, but they notice the pattern. Then they bring their own history into it. Who got invited last time? Who got included in the group photo? Who always seems to get the benefit of the doubt? And now one RSVP is carrying way too much emotional freight.
Right. And that's where the mess starts. Because now the invitation isn't just an invitation, it's being read like evidence, which is exactly why the next conversation has to slow down and define what a legitimate boundary looks like before we start arguing about who's being unreasonable.
Okay, so before we keep arguing about who should get offended, we should probably define the annoying little categories people pretend are obvious. Because they're not.
That's the useful move. People say +1 like it means one thing. But in practice, it can mean 3 different things depending on the couple, the family, and how much they care about the social fallout.
Right, and everybody acts like they're speaking the same language when they're absolutely not. One person hears +1 and thinks, bring whoever you're seeing. Another person hears it and thinks, you get one extra chair if we can survive the budget.
So the cleanest distinction is, a named guest is someone the couple specifically invites by name. A +1 is an unnamed guest attached to the invited person. And a couple invite is when the invitation is effectively for 2 people as a unit, because that relationship is already being treated as established.
And that's where people start reading status into it, because they're not hearing a label, they're hearing a verdict. Named guest can sound like, we know you and want you. +1 can sound like, we know you, but your romantic situation is still under review.
That's the emotional version, sure. The practical version is that the labels are doing 2 jobs at once. They're managing headcount, and they're signaling how the couple understands the relationship. Those 2 jobs do not always line up neatly.
Which is exactly why the whole thing gets weird. People want the label to be pure etiquette, but it's really etiquette wearing budget glasses.
That's not bad, but I'd separate etiquette from policy. Etiquette is the expectation people think should exist. Policy is what this couple is actually doing with their invites. A lot of the conflict comes from people assuming one and being given the other.
So if somebody says we don't do plus ones, they might mean we're only inviting named partners and spouses. Or they might mean we are not paying for random extra bodies, which is a much less romantic sentence, but probably the real one.
Exactly. And the same policy can read differently in different social circles. In one friend group, a plus one is assumed for anyone who's dating seriously. In another, only married couples get treated as a unit. In another, people only relax the rule if the couple has been together long enough that everyone already knows the partner.
So the label is not universal truth. It's a local custom with a guest list attached.
That's the boring definition, yes. And boring is good here, because once you know the categories, you can stop pretending every disagreement is about manners, when sometimes it's about whether the couple thinks a relationship is established enough to count.
And that established enough part is where people get touchy. Because one circle treats a serious boyfriend like automatic family, and another circle basically says, we've met him twice, so let's not act like he's entitled to a chair.
Right, and that's why the same invitation can land differently depending on the room you're in. If your social world is loose about relationships, a missing plus one feels stingy. If your world is more formal or crowded, a plus one can feel generous. Same label, different default assumption.
So it's not just about what the card says. It's about what everybody thinks that card ought to mean.
Exactly. And people almost never read these categories neutrally. They read them through their own relationship status, their own friendships, and whatever stories they already tell themselves about being included or excluded.
Which is why the person left off the list doesn't experience it as a spreadsheet problem. They experience it as, oh, cool, so apparently my relationship does not make the cut.
That reaction is real. The trick is not to pretend the feeling is fake, while also not pretending every excluded plus one is a moral insult. Sometimes the couple is drawing a line around stability, familiarity, or simple space.
So what am I missing then? If the categories are this messy, why do people keep acting like there's some clean etiquette rule that settles it?
Because a clean rule would be comforting. It would let everyone avoid the real conversation, which is, how close are we? How serious is the relationship? And how much room do we actually have? The labels are just the polite wrapper around those questions.
And once you strip off the wrapper, it gets a lot less cute and a lot more expensive.
Yeah, and that's the point where the definition stops being abstract. If the wedding is small, or the budget is tight, or the guest list is already packed with family obligations, the categories get sharper because the trade-offs are sharper.
So the same invitation can mean generosity in one circle and restraint in another, just because the social norm is different and the actual constraints are different.
That's the cleanest way to say it. Once you know the couple's world, you can usually tell whether plus one is a genuine open door, a limited compromise, or just the least awkward way to say no.
And that's probably the only fair standard here. Don't pretend the label is pure, don't pretend it's meaningless, and don't act shocked when a guest reads it as a message instead of a form field. Okay, once you strip off the polite language, the money trail is why this gets tense so fast. A wedding isn't just, can we fit one more person? It's food, venue size, rental tables, chairs, linens, the whole setup that starts charging you for every extra body. And suddenly, a plus one stops being a courtesy and becomes a line item.
That's the pressure point. Guest count is a master number because it affects catering, venue capacity, rentals, and the stuff people forget until late, like stationery, favors, transportation, and sometimes welcome bags. So when couples act obsessed with head count, they're not always inventing drama. One person really can push several other decisions.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say that's why a small exception never feels small? On paper, it's one partner or one friend, but in planning terms, it can look like a chain reaction. And then everyone starts pretending they only care about fairness when they also care about the spreadsheet.
That's fair. And once you get into a seated meal, the reception head count matters in a really literal way. The caterer wants the final count, the venue wants the final count, and some venues want that number locked in before the wedding. If you're doing a plated dinner, the seating chart and place cards have to line up with that number or the whole room gets awkward.
And one extra person is a domino, not a guest.
Exactly. It's not one chair in a vacuum. It's food service, room layout, table math, and then the social problem of who sits near whom, which is where weddings stop being a guest list and start being a map of relationships.
And that map gets ugly fast because people are not just trying to find a seat for a human being. They're trying to avoid the cousin who can't behave, keep an X away from the head table, make sure the older relatives are comfortable, and somehow do all that while pretending the seating chart is neutral. It isn't neutral. It is a tiny political board game with nicer fonts.
That's a little mean, but also not wrong. The point is that every extra guest doesn't just mean one more fork. It can mean one more table assignment, one more place card, one more problem if the room layout was already tight. If the event is built around a fixed number, the margin for flexibility disappears pretty quickly.
So the ugly truth is that budget, quote unquote, isn't always a lie. But it's also not the whole story. The words are about logistics, but the hurt is often about legitimacy. Who gets treated like a real partner, who gets treated like a maybe, and who gets told to stand outside the picture.
That's the fairer version of the suspicion. Money and capacity are real, but they don't erase the status signal, and they don't make inconsistency look better. They just give people a respectable way to say no.
And once there are limits, every exception starts sending a message, whether people want it to or not. If the guest list is already built around a final guaranteed head count, then saying yes to one person's plus one can mean reworking the count, calling the caterer, checking the venue rules, and maybe shuffling the seating chart that was supposed to be done weeks ago.
Right, and that's why couples get weirdly rigid about it. They're not just being stingy in a vacuum. They're looking at deadlines and locked numbers and thinking, if we bend here, what else moves? That doesn't make every no fair, but it does explain why the pressure shows up in such a small social decision.
Which is also why people hear the explanation differently depending on where they sit. The couple hears, we have to protect the plan. The excluded person hears, your relationship is the thing we decided was movable. Those two readings can both be emotionally real, even if only one of them is about the budget in a strict sense.
Yeah, and that is what makes this more than a math problem. Once the guest list is finite, every added person has a cost, a seating consequence, and a status consequence. So the practical standard has to be honest about the limit, apply it consistently, and don't act surprised when people notice that scarcity makes the social meaning harder to hide.
Okay, with the money part out of the way, I think the cleanest way to look at this is that there are two honest readings of the same no plus one decision. One is, this is a finite event and somebody has to draw a line. The other is, you just told me my relationship counts less than your seating chart.
That's the useful split. The couple side version is not automatically cold or fake. Sometimes it really is just capacity, budget, and a room full of physical limits. You are not hosting a philosophy seminar. You are trying to get everyone fed, seated, and moving through the night without turning the whole thing into a logistics demo.
And the guest side version is also real, which is the annoying part. If you're in a serious relationship and everybody around you knows it, being told to come solo can feel like the wedding is saying, "We acknowledge your body, but not your personhood." That's dramatic, yes, but people do feel that way. They feel singled out, not just counted.
They do. But am I overstating the insult piece if I say some people translate it too fast? Because there is a difference between a rule that is actually meant to rank relationships and a rule that is just clumsy, limited, or applied by someone who is bad at saying no.
No, that's fair. If it is a tiny wedding and the couple is strict across the board, most people can swallow it even if they hate it. You might think, okay, they invited 20 people total and there just isn't room. That feels stingy maybe, but not insulting. The problem is when it is selective. Then it starts looking like you are close enough to know about the wedding, but not close enough to bring the person who actually comes home with you.
That's the clean example. The insulting version is usually not the existence of a rule, it's the pattern around it. If some people get to bring a partner because the couple likes them, or because they're in the inner circle, and other people with equally real relationships get told to deal with it, then the logic stops sounding neutral. It sounds like status with nicer wording.
Exactly. And I think that's why guests don't just ask, "Did I get a +1?" They ask, "What does this say about how you see me?" Because weddings are one of the rare social settings where relationship status gets handled in public. You are not just left out of a dinner, you are left out of the public version of your own life.
And to be fair, some guests do jump all the way to insult when the better explanation is just scarcity. Not because they're irrational, but because people hate feeling like their partner is being treated as optional. The emotional reaction is understandable. The conclusion is what needs checking.
Right. And the reason the reaction gets so big is that this is one of those situations where the same rule lands differently depending on the relationship. If you've been together for 6 weeks, nobody is shocked. If you've been together for years, or you're clearly building a life together, no +1 can feel less like a neutral limit and more like a subtle demotion.
That's the pressure point. The couple can still be acting in good faith, but they should not pretend the rule is emotionally weightless. Once you put people on a guest list, you are making a tiny public statement about belonging, whether you want to or not. That does not mean every slight is intentional. It means the social meaning is built into the format.
So the fair version of the complaint is not, "You are evil because you have limits." It's more like, if you're going to draw a hard line, admit it is a hard line and don't dress it up as some sacred principle about who counts as real family. That is where people get annoyed. Not the limit itself, the fake moral varnish on top of it.
And the fair version of the couple's defense is, we are not judging your relationship. We are triaging a limited guest list, and we are trying to be consistent. If they can say that plainly, a lot of the resentment becomes easier to understand, even if it does not disappear. Both readings still hold up, which is exactly why nobody walks away feeling perfectly satisfied.
Okay, but this is where the polite answer starts doing that fake logistics thing. People say, "We're just trying to keep the guest list manageable." And the person hearing it is thinking, "Cool. So my partner is the one you were willing to cut."
Or at least the one they didn't want to make room for.
Right. And that is why it lands like an insult, even when the organizer thinks they're just being practical. The official reason and the felt reason are not the same thing.
That split is the whole problem. The official reason can be true and still not be the whole social message. We have a limit might be honest, but it can also be doing cover work for we made a choice about whose relationships count first.
So what's the fair version of that? I don't want to turn every seat limit into a secret referendum on somebody's relationship, but I also don't want to pretend people are crazy for hearing a slight when the wording sounds slippery.
The fair version is usually don't mind read, but don't sanitize either. Intent matters, impact matters, and pattern matters. One awkward wedding decision can just be logistics. 3 versions of the same excuse aimed at the same person or the same kind of partner starts to look like a social rule, not a one-off accident.
And the reason people bristle is because the polished explanation invites them to translate it. Nobody wants to be the person standing there decoding, do they mean money, space, family politics, or do they just not like my boyfriend?
Exactly. If you make somebody do the translation work, they are going to read into it, sometimes unfairly, sometimes accurately. But the burden shifts the moment the explanation gets vague enough to protect the couple from saying the uncomfortable part out loud.
And that awkward part is often not, we hate your partner. It's more like, we pick the people we see as central and your person didn't make the cut. That's a very different statement, but I can see why it still stings.
Yeah, and that's where intent and impact stop lining up neatly. A couple can mean we are being brutally practical, while the guest hears you and your relationship are lower status in this room. Neither reading is guaranteed to be malicious. One of them is just more socially revealing.
Which is why space is limited can be a sincere sentence and a lousy sentence at the same time. It may be true, but true isn't the same thing as complete. And complete is what people usually want when they're trying to figure out whether they're being dismissed.
And weddings are a weird place because everybody acts like this is all sacred etiquette. But really, it's social triage with nicer clothes on. If you exclude someone, the cleanest thing is to give enough context that they can understand the decision without having to invent a theory about their own worth.
That's the part people skip. They hear be transparent and think it means deliver a whole speech about budgets and feelings. It doesn't. It means don't hand somebody a polished line if you're not willing to own the obvious social meaning of it.
Right, because the polished line is often trying to prevent conflict, but it can also create a different conflict later. If the person feels like they were managed instead of told the truth, you've saved yourself one awkward conversation and bought a much worse one.
So, the lazy version of this argument is anyone who complains is being oversensitive. And the equally lazy counter is every restricted invite is a secret insult. Both are too neat. The real story is that polite language can be honest, incomplete, or evasive, and people can usually tell which one they're getting.
That's the useful standard. Don't assume bad faith. But don't pretend wording is neutral when it obviously carries social meaning. The next mistake is thinking the only alternative to politeness is cruelty. And that's where people get this whole thing wrong.
Okay, but this is where people make it too clean. They want +1 rules to be either just logistics or a personal insult. In real life, it's usually both a budget choice and a social message, whether the couple intended it that way or not.
That's the cleaner correction. The dumb version is, it's all etiquette, so nobody should read into it. Or the opposite. If you didn't get one, they hate you. Neither one survives 5 minutes of contact with an actual wedding. The decision usually mixes room, money, closeness, and how much social fallout the couple can tolerate.
And weddings are weird because every choice gets read like a message. People don't just hear, we're tight on seats. They hear, you're not important enough, or your relationship doesn't count, or we decided your drama wasn't worth the trouble.
Sometimes that read is fair. Sometimes it's projection. That's the piece people skip. The same invite can feel perfectly normal to one guest and deeply pointed to another, because they're not starting from the same place.
So are you saying every +1 decision is a status judgment, or just that it functions like one even when nobody wants it to?
The second one. I don't think every couple is sitting there ranking human worth like it's a miserable little spreadsheet. But the decision still sorts people. It says, this relationship gets room, or this one doesn't. And that is socially meaningful, even when the couple thinks they're just being practical.
Right, and that is why the fake clean explanation drives me nuts. People talk like, the rule descended from the mountain with a clipboard. But etiquette guidance itself treats it as discretionary. It depends on budget, venue capacity, and how close the couple actually is to the person asking.
Exactly. And once it's discretionary, the social friction is built in. If there were one universal rule, everybody could at least argue from the same standard. Instead, different families and friend groups bring different norms, different hierarchy assumptions, and different levels of sensitivity around what counts as fair.
Which is why one person hears reasonable planning and another hears you got demoted. Same invite, totally different emotional read. And honestly, both reactions can make sense depending on who the guest is and how the relationship looks from the outside.
That's the useful distinction. A lot of people overread it by assuming every denied +1 is a deliberate slight. But couples can underread it too if they act like the choice only affects the guest list and not the room. It changes seating, energy, and who feels settled versus awkward all night.
And that's where the patterns matter. Established partners usually get treated differently from random dates. Wedding party people often get priority. Single guests sometimes get a +1 if they'd otherwise walk in knowing almost nobody. None of that is a magic law, but it's not random either.
No, and that pattern is exactly why the same policy can be read two ways. If you're the person with a long-term partner, a denial can feel like you don't count as a real unit. If you're the couple staring at a packed venue, it can feel like simple triage. Both are understandable. They just aren't the same position.
And people also act like the couple's explanation has to be pure before anyone can accept it. That's too neat. Most of the time, it's a mix. Budget, closeness, optics, and who they can afford to annoy without turning the whole wedding into a side drama.
That's the part worth keeping. It's not just logistics, and it's not pure disrespect. It's a boring constraint with a social edge attached. The couple may not be trying to humiliate anybody, but they are still making a judgment about where someone sits in the circle of people that matter.
Which means the guest isn't crazy for noticing it, and the couple isn't automatically evil for doing it. That tension is the whole problem. Once you admit the invite is doing more than one job, you can't pretend the reaction came from nowhere.
Exactly. The real mistake is treating your own read as the obvious one. The next fight is what happens when everybody thinks they're being objective and everybody else is the emotional one.
Okay, once we accept that the couple has limited seats, limited money, and a bunch of family obligations they didn't invent. The next question is, how much of this drama is actually the wedding, and how much is everybody else turning it into a referendum on their own importance? Because a lot of people do not hear, we can't invite everyone. They hear, you are less important than the cousin we barely know.
That is the pressure point. The invite stops being a planning choice and starts feeling like a social verdict. And once that happens, everyone behaves worse. The couple gets defensive, the person left out gets hurt, and the families start ranking relationships out loud, which is always a bad look.
And people absolutely do that. Nobody wants to admit they care about status, so they dress it up as principle. We just wanted clarity. No, sometimes you wanted the invitation to mean we matter, which is not some monster feeling. It's just a very human little ego check. And wedding culture is extremely good at poking it.
Sam, am I overstating the vanity piece there? Because some of this feels less like raw ego and more like people wanting an honest signal that the relationship is recognized. That's different from wanting to be adored.
That's fair, and I think that's actually the cleaner version of it. It is not always, please worship me. A lot of the time it's, do I count in this person's life the way I thought I did? And wedding culture is one of the few places where adults still expect some kind of official-looking signal. The minute one person starts narrating it in the group chat, the whole thing stops being about logistics and turns into
a status fight.
Yeah, and the group chat is basically where all restraint goes to die, because now everybody is adding commentary, asking who knew what, comparing invitations, and pretending they're just being objective. Nobody says, I'm hurt because I wanted to feel close to you. They say, I'm just trying to understand the logic, which is usually a very polite way of saying, please explain why I didn't make the list.
And that's why this stuff keeps spreading. The social reward goes to the person who can turn a small omission into a larger story. That does not mean the hurt is fake. It means the environment makes it easy to read every exclusion as a statement about rank. And once that interpretation is in play, even boring constraints start looking personal.
Right, and we should be honest that the rest of us feed it too. People notice who got a +1, who didn't, who got the spouse invited, who got the new partner treated like a real partner, and they absolutely file that away. Not because they're evil, because they are human, and because weddings are one of the few times where the guest list feels like it says something real about your place in the tribe.
So what part of that is actually fair? I think the usable version is pretty simple. You can feel hurt, you can be curious, and you can ask once, privately, if there was some obvious misunderstanding. What's not fair is demanding that the couple explain your exact rank or turn the guest list into a public referendum on your importance.
Yeah, and that's the line people keep wandering past. One private question is normal. 2 or 3 rounds of follow-up usually means you're not asking about logistics anymore. You're trying to get them to certify your importance. That is where curiosity starts turning into entitlement. And that's probably the boundary we need to hold before we get into where that line actually sits in practice. Okay, once we've admitted there might be a real slight here, the next question is where the line sits between normal disappointment and turning somebody else's wedding into your personal complaint department. Because that's the part people skip. They go straight from, I feel weird about this, to, I'm going to make this a social trial.
That's the right frame. Private disappointment is one thing. Public pressure is another. You can feel annoyed, even hurt, without assuming you've been handed a moral license to interrogate the couple, recruit allies, or make the guest list everybody's problem.
So where would you draw the line then? Because I think people here don't make a big deal out of it and immediately translate that into never ask a question, never be honest, just swallow it and smile. That's too neat and also kind of insulting.
I draw it at the point where the question stops being about understanding and starts being about leverage. A reasonable ask is private, brief, and ready to hear no. It sounds like, "Hey, I wanted to check something because I'm close to you, and I wasn't sure how you were thinking about it." A coercive ask already has a verdict baked in. Explain yourself until I feel satisfied.
Right. And the weird part is that people often think the volume is the problem when it's really the persistence. The first question might be fair. The second one might still be fair. But once you're asking the same thing 3 different ways, you're not seeking clarity anymore. You're trying to wear the person down until they either apologize or hand you a story that flatters you.
Exactly. And that is the moment it stops being about the wedding and becomes about your own status. If you need a committee hearing to decide whether you count as special, you've already left the reasonable zone. Weddings bring that out in people because the invitation starts to feel like a verdict, when sometimes it's just a spreadsheet problem with flowers.
There is a real middle area, though. Some relationships are close enough that a person is allowed to ask once and be a little wounded if the answer is no, we're keeping it small. That's not entitlement. That's human. People hate hearing "not you," even when the reason is practical, and the embarrassment can hit before they've thought it through.
I buy that. The important part is what happens after the wound. You can have the feeling without promoting it to a campaign. If the relationship is genuinely close, one careful conversation is reasonable. If it's more distant, you probably get disappointment and maybe a private complaint to your dog or your one friend who can be trusted not to turn it into theater.
And the group chat is where this thing goes to die or metastasize. Somebody says, "Wow, that's weird," and now half the room is doing guestless forensics like they have a badge and a flashlight. That never makes the wedding less awkward. It just gives everyone a hobby. It makes the person getting married look like the villain in a story they never agreed to star in.
That's the other line worth drawing. Gossiping about it usually makes it worse. If you weren't invited, being dramatic about it doesn't restore dignity. It mostly creates a bigger mess around somebody else's planning choices. And if you were invited, but just not with the +1 you wanted, the public outrage version still tends to make you look less wronged and more invested in winning.
I still don't want to give hosts a free pass to be icy and then act offended when nobody asks why. There's a difference between "we had a limit" and "we wanted you to feel the limit." Those are not the same thing, and people can usually tell which one they got.
That's fair. The humane version is hosts get to set limits, but they don't get to pretend limits are invisible to the people inside them. And guests get to feel slighted without turning that feeling into an entitlement claim that has to be litigated in public. The better boundary is not "nobody cares." It's care privately before you go looking for a fight.
So maybe the clean rule is ask once privately, only if you're close enough that the question makes sense. If the answer is no, stop there unless there's some actual new information. Otherwise, you're not clarifying anything. You're trying to drag the issue into daylight and make everybody pick a side.
Yeah, and the deeper standard is that disappointment is allowed. A careful question is sometimes allowed. Pressure is not. If people want fewer blow-ups, the fix starts before the invitation goes out. Be clearer earlier. Don't leave people guessing about the rule. And don't make every awkward decision sound like a personal judgment. That alone would cut down a lot of the drama.
So we're not saying nobody gets to feel weird about it. We're saying don't turn the weird feeling into a public campaign.
Exactly. And if the next move is to make these situations less explosive, It's probably less mystery, less guesswork, and a lot less crowdsourced outrage over who was or wasn't supposed to count.
Okay, so if we've already admitted weddings can't be perfectly fair, the useful question is, what actually makes them less miserable? Because a lot of the drama isn't the rule itself, it's the surprise. People can handle no a lot better than they can handle, wait, why am I the exception?
That's the first fix. Decide the +1 rule early and say it plainly, not in a cryptic little side conversation 2 weeks before the ceremony, and not after people have already built expectations. The awkward part is usually not the limit, it's the late reveal.
So the policy has to exist before the social theater starts. If you're going to say spouses, serious partners, or no guests at all, just say it. Don't make people decode the invitation like it's a puzzle where the prize is getting mildly embarrassed. So, what would you actually do if you were drawing the line?
I'd make the rule visible and keep it consistent. That matters more than pretending you have no policy. If one cousin gets a random exception because somebody pushed hard enough, everybody else notices. Then the rule stops feeling like a logistics choice and starts feeling like favoritism with better stationery.
Right, and that's where the clean version is almost offensively simple. Name the invited people directly. Keep the list synced with the seating chart, and don't use vague and guest language unless you actually mean it. If the invitation is pretending to be flexible when it isn't, that's where the mess starts.
Careful. That half-hidden version is the whole problem. If it's no +1s, say no +1s. If it's partners only, say partners only. The issue is the in-between version that leaves people guessing and then acts surprised when they guess wrong.
Yeah, because the real injury is getting singled out by improvisation. A guest can shrug off a limit. What people resent is being told the limit was never a limit until it hit them. That's when it stops being a planning problem and starts feeling personal.
And couples can make that easier without sounding cold. Put the names on the invitation. Keep the guest list and seating plan in the same universe, and communicate the cutoff early enough that nobody feels like the numbers changed after the emotional commitment. The venue deadline is not the guest's fault, but it is real. So pretending you can decide everything later just creates a moving target.
And that's the part people keep trying to soften until it breaks. They think if they never state the rule directly, they'll avoid sounding harsh. But all they do is swap one awkward conversation for 5 more confusing ones, and now everybody is reading between lines that shouldn't have been there.
Exactly. Direct is often kinder here than vaguely sympathetic. You can say, "We wish we could invite everyone, but we have a firm guest limit, so we're only able to include named guests." That's not charming, but it is legible. People don't need a poem. They need to know what the rule is.
That's the weird thing about etiquette. The nicer sounding version is often the one that wastes everybody's time. If you say the real thing early, at least the disappointed person can decide what kind of disappointed they want to be. If you keep it fuzzy, you just hand them a future argument.
And the real fix is not pretending fairness is available in unlimited quantities. It's making the reason legible before people attach meaning to it. If the answer is budget, space, or a hard venue cutoff, say that once and keep it true across the guest list. That's the difference between "we had a limit" and "we made an exception because we liked them more."
Yeah, and if you want one simple norm that actually helps, it's this. Decide early, say it clearly, and don't improvise different rules for different people. Nobody likes scarcity, but people can live with scarcity when it looks honest. What they can't stand is the fake flexibility that turns into a personality test.
That's probably the cleanest version. Not perfect, not emotionally painless, just less insulting. You still have to disappoint somebody, but at least you're not asking them to play detective while pretending the rule doesn't exist.
Okay, I think the clean landing is this. Most +1 fights are not some cartoon villain move. They're what happens when scarce seats, money, and social status all get crammed into one little invitation rule, and then everybody pretends it's only about logistics.
That's the version worth keeping. The couple usually has a real limit, the guest has a real expectation, and then everybody starts reading the rule as a verdict on the relationship. That's why it gets bigger than the spreadsheet says it should.
And that's why it gets stupid so fast. A wedding invite is never just paper. It carries this little public message about who counts, who doesn't, and who gets to bring backup without asking permission, like a normal adult.
Sure, but we should separate the message from the motive. Sometimes the message is accidental. Sometimes it's careless. And sometimes it's basically the point. Those are different fights, and the advice changes depending on which one you're actually dealing with.
So, Joe, am I overstating the status part, or is that basically what people are reacting to when they get bent out of shape about a no +1 rule?
No, I think that's real. The status piece is usually there whether people admit it or not. The important correction is that noticing status pressure doesn't mean the couple is being cruel on purpose. It means humans are annoyingly good at hearing rank in every little boundary.
Right, and I think that's the honest middle. Don't assume evil, but don't act shocked when people take it personally. If you tell someone no +1, a lot of them are hearing, you are not fully in this circle, even if you thought you were just making a head count decision.
And they're not crazy for hearing that. The rule may be practical, but the emotional meaning is still real. That's why the polite explanation has to be a real explanation, not a foggy little speech that sounds nice and explains nothing.
A foggy little speech is exactly what people try to use, though. Oh, it's just logistics. Well, maybe. But if it were only logistics, people wouldn't be doing all this private damage control afterward, trying to make everyone feel less rejected without actually changing the rule.
Mostly because they know the ugly part is the status part. They don't want to say, we had to choose who mattered more, because that sounds harsh, even when it's just what a guest list does. Every list is a ranking device wearing nicer clothes.
So if you're the person getting told no, the useful move is not to immediately declare war. The useful move is to ask which part is actually driving it. Budget, venue size, a consistency rule, or some weird exception that tells you the real meaning is different from the stated one.
That's the right filter. Because if the rule is consistent, explainable, and proportionate, you're probably looking at a boring but real constraint. If it's selective, vague, or obviously tracked to status, then yeah, people are going to feel the insult, even if nobody says it out loud.
And if you're the couple, the takeaway is almost the same in reverse. Say the real reason early, keep the rule consistent, and don't hide behind fake serenity like that makes it kinder. People can handle a boundary a lot better than they can handle a boundary with a dumb little costume on it.
That is probably the most honest version. You don't have to pretend +1 decisions are sacred or catastrophic. Just admit they're a mix of logistics, money, and social meaning, and then make the call in a way that doesn't invent extra drama. That's basically the whole game. And with that, we're done with this question. Thanks for spending a few minutes with Say the Question. Subscribe or follow, and we'll be back tomorrow.